Thank you for watching this video from the Center for European Studies at Carleton University. This event was organized by the Center for European Studies and Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, and supported by Carleton University and by grants from the European Union and Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the European Union, Center for European Studies, and Carleton University.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to talk today, and I'm going to follow up a little bit on that on the Canadian side. It'll be a little bit different because a lot of you are from Canada, so I'm assuming you know more about the kind of day-to-day politics of these issues here. Let's see if I click the right button. Okay, so this is just a brief outline of three topics I'm going to talk about. A little bit about appreciating the Canadian context, which will you'll see some implicit parallels and contrasts with the European context. Then setting this in a longer-term vision, and then some of my suggestions on how we move this forward from the point of view of today. I guess one thing I just want to say at the beginning is that there's a kind of tension in the title of this workshop, and I think it's deliberate. But renewables and climate change policy or decarbonization are not absolutely synonymous. In other words, renewables policy can fill a variety of objectives, but it isn't reduced to climate change. And also climate change isn't reduced to the question of deploying renewables. So there are interesting tensions between the two, and I think they'll come out a little bit in my talk. So to start a little bit then on the context of the low carbon transition and new renewable deployment in Canada. So I want to first kind of talk about just some characteristics of the Canadian context. So the first one is kind of really obvious that Canada has historically had a GHG-intensive development trajectory. What that means is that for more than a century, our comparative international advantage has been to exploit large spaces, cheap natural resources in order to build an industrial structure that's competitive internationally. So we traded on these advantages. Whoops, somebody comes along and says, oh, but that's emitting huge amounts of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases isn't good. And yes, so we have an industrial strategy that is, if you like, maladapted to new conditions, which are the conditions of a decarbonizing world. So obviously Canada is a major fossil fuel producer and exporter, and also we have a particularly high GHG intensity of our GDP when compared to other industrialized countries, and among the highest per capita emissions in the world in industrialized countries, up there with Australia and so on. A second kind of critical thing is regionally distinct energy political economies. So those industrial structures that have developed have been quite differentiated across the country. It's a big country with different resource bases, and the economies and also the political linkages related to those economies are quite different. So Quebec, with a hydro-based system, attracts aluminum industry, aerospace, looks very different than Alberta, which is rich in hydrocarbons, and then builds an industrial structure that's quite closely related to that. So you have resources in the development model, but you also have a very decentralized federation and jurisdictional issues too that mean that provinces control their own natural resources largely. Electricity systems are largely fragmented and have different legal and regulatory structures in different regions of the country, which tie in with the different, if you like, industrial development strategies in those regions. Well, partly related to all of the above, we've had a history of weak climate change policy over the past 20 years, mainly relying on non-regulatory type instruments, i.e. non-obligatory instruments, voluntary challenges and things like that. Some instability between governments, designs of emissions trading systems that never ever got implemented and things like that. And I've got just this slide, which I know other people have used. You'll see it here, which is Canada's emissions, our emissions and our emissions reductions targets. I realize it may be hard to read it all, but the trend line at the top is kind of Canada's emissions. And you notice we did have a big decline there around 2008, but we've actually been creeping up a bit. And then the horizontal lines are our various targets. So the one furthest on the left, which is hard to see because it's actually on the just about on the 600 line there, was from the from the original climate change convention, where there was a aspirational target, which we didn't meet. And then the next one is Kyoto, and then the third one across kind of in the middle is Copenhagen, and the very last one, which goes lower than any of them, is our intended nationally determined contribution, which is the one the government just recently announced. So what you'll see is basically the cuts we promise keep getting deeper and further in the future, but actually we don't really go down very much. Not to say that there hasn't been a decline from the peak, but we certainly have trouble meeting those targets. So there is a clear contrast with, say, the EU situation that we just looked at. Okay, so I call that the sad history of climate change politics in Canada, which I am not going to rehearse now. And there are a number of people in the audience, including Doug MacDonald and others, who have told this story and in much more detail and looked at the role Alberta has played, the resource industries, veto coalition, veto actors, let's say. But let's say so far we've had, and of course the present government has basically not been interested. Not that there are no measures whatsoever at the federal level, but the coal, for instance, the coal phase out, they didn't do the heavy lifting. It was Ontario that did the heavy lifting on that first, and so on. On the other hand, there have been some kind of what you could call recent encouraging trends. So the Ontario coal phase out, the BC carbon tax, Ontario now joining with the cap and trade system with Quebec, and with the election of the NDP, in particular, the idea of a more fundamental reform of the Alberta specified gas emitter system suggests that, well, already we know the vast majority of Canadians, about 80%, will be under some form of carbon pricing, but there still, of course, remain major problems in terms of coordination and seeing where all this is going to go. And of course, with the current election, it's kind of, a lot of it is up in the air. So I'm still on some of these kind of big circumstances in the Canadian context. So economic integration with the United States, which is obviously important in terms of markets for oil, which is, if you like, it's nice to have a big customer, but it's a problem if the big customer finds lots of shale oil and doesn't need your oil, or isn't so enthusiastic about your pipelines and things like that. But also, of course, there's kind of, I don't want to call it political and cultural integration, but there are certainly influences, and the US is the biggest market for Canadian exports, so arguments that Canada should go ahead of the US are met with kind of skepticism from the business community and so on. So it's certainly a kind of a major context influencing how climate policy develops here. So the next point is really important and is often forgotten by people, which is that actually, if you were just to stand back and say, how is our electricity system doing? Well, it's not doing too bad. It's 80% carbon-free, and a bit more than 60% of that is hydro, and a bit less than 20% of that is nuclear, essentially Ontario. And independent of whether you're a fan of nuclear or not, that's still among the most decarbonized electricity systems in the world. Now, I'm not saying it's because Canadians have such great climate change policy. It's an accident of abundant natural resources. But it does create a kind of interesting context, and it helps explain why, even if you were interested in climate change, building lots of windmills or solar panels isn't the first thing that's on your mind when you have very substantial hydro resources. So, of course, with large regional variations because it's more or less alternating as you go across the country in terms of, so you have Newfoundland with and Labrador with abundant hydro resources, Quebec with the almost 100% hydro system, lots in BC, lots in Manitoba, but then you've got Ontario quite mixed in its generation, with more than 60% of the actual power used in the last couple of years coming from nuclear. And of course, places like Alberta with more than 60% coal. So we had a kind of, I would describe it as a delayed interest in new renewables. That's actually not so strange from other places with very high hydro penetration. So for instance, Norway is among the laggards in Europe on renewable energy. They have a 100% hydro system, and at first they kind of said, well, why would you waste your time with windmills or solar and so on. But with some experience, particularly you've got wind in Alberta, Quebec, and Ontario, and particularly Ontario, which over the past, going back 8 or 10 years, but particularly in the last 5 years, has rolled out a lot. And the graphs that you will see for wind in Ontario or solar PV in Ontario look a lot like the graphs that you will see in Germany in terms of that steep exponential curve, though it's now leveling off. So I kind of come to this almost last, with an absolutely massive renewable potential. So we have better solar resources than Germany does. We have masses of wind both on the coasts and in the prairies. We have thousands of square kilometers that could be hundreds of thousands that could be biomass. Tidal and possible ocean power on the coast. We're drowning in the potential for renewable energy. And so this is the last kind of contextual element I'll put, that it's clear that in the last particularly 5 years, very rapidly falling prices for new renewable technologies and increasing international deployment. And I would say even in some contexts, situations in which incumbent traditional energy providers are beginning to get nervous. And we heard a little bit the German case where for the first time some of the major power companies in Germany are actually losing money because solar can be cheaper at certain times of day, so their fossil plants are not running as much as they should to make money. And you get things in the US, things like discussions of the utility death spiral, that too many people will put solar panels up and how we'll be able to pay for the grid and things like that. So renewable energy is changing in its perception, and the perception is that it could actually, for the incumbents, that it actually could begin to be a threat rather than just a pain in the ass or something that we're forced to install in our system and costs us and is awkward to connect because it's decentralized and so on. So now I just want to bring us back. So that's some of the things that have kind of influenced, if you want, why Canada hasn't been that proactive on with respect to new renewables. Now I want to just shift us back and say, well, let's look at the perspective for the longer term where we need to go. So let's just take, and we can argue about it, but let's just take this idea of a long-term decarbonization objective of something more than 80% by mid-century, which is kind of consistent with the 2-degree target, and it's consistent with the longer-term objectives in Europe and so on, which basically means you kind of need more or less a carbon emission-free energy system by mid-century. So that's kind of 2015. Well, you could, move it off a decade and argue about that, but that's where we would need to be going. So in that context, some of you may have heard of this this project called the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, which I suggest people look up. You can find it online if you haven't seen it, but it's a UN initiative with a whole bunch of countries looking at if they were really challenged to try and get 80 to 90% reductions by mid-century, how could you possibly do it in China, the United States, France, the UK, and so on? So a Canada study was done as part of that. And all sorts of debatable issues about looking that far in the future and so on. But basically, the lesson that comes out of the examining various possible pathways is you basically have to electrify as much as you can. You've got to get more than 50% of the total energy burden onto electricity by the middle of the century, which comes down to perhaps doubling the total electricity consumption. And that's even including all sorts of energy efficiency gains and all sorts of other things. So you could say, well, maybe that's wrong. Maybe we only need to increase it 60% or 70% or whatever. The point is, you need to get essentially transport, domestic heating, a large part of industry onto the electricity system. If you were to squeeze out, so you have to squeeze out gas as a heating, natural gas as a heating thing. You've got to get rid of gasoline in cars. It's very difficult to do that with present technology for heavy goods vehicles, trucks and things. So that is, you're going to perhaps need biofuels for that. But passenger vehicles have to be electrified. So this is a kind of, you can think of it as a further extension of the project of societal electrification. You've got to shift more of the burden onto electricity. That doesn't mean, of course, it all has to be centrally generated. It can be generated at source, and you can have distributed generation and so on. So the thing that follows from that is inevitably new renewables have to be a major part of that. But I say not just new renewables because there are other things. There's the nuclear fleet, particularly Ontario, and you have to decide, do you renew that? Do you build new, or do you just recondition them so they'll go for another 30 years? But were you to say, well, we'll just wind that down, that's an extra 60% of the total electricity in Ontario you've got to replace with something, independent of the fact that you're needing to ramp up electricity production, particularly after kind of 2030. So new renewables, therefore, are important. There is also the CCS option, which is not popular necessarily with anybody, but CCS will be needed for industrial processes, independent of whether, if you don't like it with coal, back out the coal. Well, then maybe you'll use it for gas. If you don't want to use it for electricity generation, fine. But still, there are things like cement production, iron, there's all sorts of things where CCS probably will be needed on industrial processes. So this is, myself and other colleagues think that this is a good political goal, which is to suggest that for an interim goal, we think about just getting unmitigated fossil out of the power generation mix by 2035. You could probably do it quicker. Get a clean power system, and then you've got no worries. Everything else you electrify is decarbonized. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. And I mean, I'm not quibbling about where you can have a few percentage of gas. I mean, I'm not being an absolute purist, but as a political goal, it's feasible because we have the resources. It's not without cost, but it can be done. And I mentioned about decarbonizing transport and the built environment. The one thing I just add on that is the traditional approach to climate change policy is the electricity system is this easy to do because we got many ways to make electricity. Let's do that and leave transport because it's so hard and we'll deal with it in future decades. But transport and the sale of petroleum is the power base of the incumbent fossil fuel regime. Every percentage point that you can dip personal automobiles from using fossil fuels weakens them politically. You can see this with the recent crash in the oil price. the wind went out of the sails of the modern princes in the oil patch in Alberta, but also their political influence. So my point is governments should be working now, even if it's not the best cost option, to push alternative fuels, electric vehicles, into this market to weaken because of its knock-on effect on weakening the political power of the fossil industry. Okay, moving forward today. I'll be quick. Well, for Canada, you need to strengthen the policy framework. So in the first instance, that means carbon pricing, and that all depends on what's going to happen with the election and what sort of coordination mechanism will be developed and so on. There are other things to be done too, but I'll leave it at that for now. I know I keep banging on about this, but I think it is really important to frame current discussion of climate change in the context of a long-term societal transformation to a decarbonized society. If you don't know that's where you're going, all your arguments about should we have this percentage cut or that percentage, should we have a bio bus or an electric bus, you can't do that unless you know in 35 years or 40 years, we need to be there. So when making our infrastructure decisions today, let's think about a decarbonized goal as well as just the current goal. I mentioned the regional aspect. I think there's a lot of mileage encouraging regional clusters to think about what makes sense in their region. And that's not to break regions up, because particularly on the decarbonization and electricity side, there can be a lot of help between provinces. So hydro and non-hydro provinces alternate. So Alberta could get hydro from BC, could get hydro from Saskatchewan, could get it from Manitoba. Nova Scotia, there's Muskrat Falls in Newfoundland and so on. So provinces can work together, but also we should think about these regional strategies. And the last point I'll make just as a pitch for green economic policy. We saw in the EU context that jobs and green industries help sell the decarbonization. And I think in the Canadian context, that's true as well. Of course, industrial policy can be done very stupidly, but I think it can also be done more subtly to build a new industrial structure using the low carbon resources that Canada has that we have so abundantly. Thank you very much.